During this unit, we have worked to focus on answering two big questions. What government policies encouraged westward expansion, and how did westward expansion have consequences? What we've learned is that the government purposely did things to help people move west, and Americans moving west had both positive consequences for Americans and negative consequences for the native population. So let's start with this review, hopefully 15 minutes or less, which will help us get an overview of the entire unit, so when we come to class tomorrow, we are ready to discuss what we still need help with and what makes sense. What does the government do? Our first step, the government has to get people to move west, so they have to get the railroad built, so there's easy transportation. Step one is somehow help companies who are willing to build the railroad figure out how they're going to afford to do it. Since the government doesn't have money that they can just hand out, the government looks at what they do have. They have tons of land. Look at the map. What we see are these gray areas. These gray areas are all the land that the government gave to different railroad companies for free. Now the Transcontinental Railroad is this one right here. And you can kind of see a faint line in the center that I'm trying to trace through this gray area. That was the actual railroad. But the gray area on either side of these faint lines you're seeing is the free land the government gives. Now that free land is great because the railroad companies are going to turn around and they're going to sell it. They're going to advertise in Europe to people in Europe who cannot afford land in Europe. Those immigrants are going to come over to the U.S. They're going to advertise it in the eastern half of the United States, and those settlers are going to come west. As those people move west to purchase land that is cheaper anywhere else in the world, towns are going to develop. And those towns are going to develop right along the railroad, which again is going to encourage more people to move west and encourage more people to use the railroad. So it's a win-win situation for the government and for the railroad companies. Now initially, getting land is great, but the railroad companies have to pay for their workers, they have to pay for their supplies, and so the government's going to give them subsidies. The government will loan them money temporarily to kind of have startup costs to pay the workers, to pay for those iron spikes, to pay for the iron rails. And then again, the railroad companies, when they sell the land, can pay the government back. What do these two things together do? Well, it allows just about anyone to immigrate, because during this time period, the government has almost no limits on immigration. As a result, railroad companies actively advertise in China for workers to come over and build half of the railroad. Now, Chinese workers were used primarily on the western half of the railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's going to be Irish immigrants who are already here in the United States who are going to build these portions of the railroads. So our immigrants can come over and build, but also our immigrants can come over and purchase the land and settle, which is something that's not really available in Europe at this time. Now that the government has a way for people to get west, and realistically this is happening at the same time the railroad is being built, other things are going to draw people to the west. And there are other policies the government's going to have that encourages those people to move west. One of the things that happens through no planning of the government is in 1848, gold is discovered in California. Now, when gold is discovered in California, people all over the world get what's called gold fever. They rush out west to California and they're looking to get rich quick. Now, with all these different people converging and settling in California and claiming, this is my land, and this is my land, and this is my land, at the same time, the United States is officially acquiring California from Mexico at the end of the Mexican War in what's called the Mexican Cession. So now the United States owns this land that has a pretty diverse population in California. There are Mexicanos, there are people or Californios who live there, who used to be Mexican citizens, but now are stuck living in the United States because their land has been given away. There are people from European nations there. There are people from China there, all participating in the gold rush. The United States government, though, whenever there's a legal battle in terms of who actually owns the land, pretty consistently supports white American land claims, and just about any other nationality, when who owns the land is called into question, loses. The other thing we see is that the government does their very best to allow new states such as California to join as quickly as possible so that the people living in those areas get full rights as full states as soon as possible. This is going to encourage more people to move west because they can be reassured that the land they settle will become a state as soon as possible. Now, how else do we get people west? Again, remember, the government doesn't have a lot of money, but what they do have is a lot of land. Out west, as a result of early Spanish settlement, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of cows literally roaming wild. And if you were hardworking, if you had a horse and you had some skills, you could go out west and you could capture these cattle. And you could claim them as your own. But in order to have a business, you have to keep your cattle alive. And that's where it could have gotten really expensive. Except what the government told those who were willing to move out west and willing to capture these cattle and claim them as their own and kind of start a cattle industry was they said, you can use the open range. You can use open government land that's not being used for anything else to let your cows wander for free, eat the grass for free, and that'll save you on startup cost because you won't have to buy a ton of land. And then at the end of the year, what the cowboys would do, you see in the center picture right here, is they would round up all the cows that had been marked as theirs, and they would then, in our third picture here, they would drive them north. They would herd them, kind of like we see in the middle. The cowboys are surrounding the cows and they're encouraging them to all walk in the same location or the same direction. They would herd them north to the railroad lines that have been built, where they would sell their cows to an agent, to a salesman at those towns, and the cows then would be transported east to cities like Chicago, New York City, where the beef would be sold at a much higher price. So we have, to recap, three major things. The government encourages encourages the building of the Transcontinental Railroad by helping those railroads financially. The government encourages people to join as full states to make sure that they had their legal rights. And the government also provided land for the early cattle ranchers to settle and to feed their cows on for free. Finally, and what makes the biggest change other than the railroad out west is the Homestead Act. The government begins taking all of that land that they had been allowing the cattle ranchers to feed their cows on for free and begins to give it away. The idea is, while the cattle ranchers are out there, it's still very sparsely, very little populated. And as a result, it's still what we think of as the wild, wild west. However, if you can get whole families to move out west and whole families to settle and farm, this will become more established, you will have more towns, and it'll become more settled. So the Homestead Act gives 160 acres of free land to almost anyone. Remember, single women could go out west and claim this 160 acres of free land. Truthfully, it would be insanely difficult for a single woman to farm 160 acres of land on her own. It'd be almost impossible for a single man to do it. It takes an entire family. This was such hard work. But single women could get land, and freed slaves could get land. So this is kind of a change in our concept out west of who is able to get land, and kind of a signal that the government is seeing the West as a more equal area. And so as we said, you get 160 acres, and what you had to do was you had to promise to farm the land, as we can see in this bottom picture. You had to promise to build a house. Did not have to be a great house. If we look at this top picture, it certainly doesn't look like anything we want to live in. But if you look at this bottom picture, you can see more established farmers were able to build houses that were a little bit bigger. And you had to live there for 5 years. Now, living out west was very difficult. If you look at this bottom picture, you can see it's very open. There are no trees. As a result, to build your house out of wood was almost impossible. So over here in this right-hand picture, this picture right here on the left, what we see is a house that's actually built out of sod. They took and they cut bricks of grass and stacked those bricks of grass on top of each other and often dug into any hills or into the ground, so they only had to build a certain number of walls. Made it very damp, very cramped living. But given that the land was free, given that this was a fresh start, hundreds of thousands of people moved west and settled these. Truth is, less than 50% of people were still living on their homesteads after that 5 years. It was really just that difficult. One of the things that makes it that difficult is the number of Native Americans who are moving out west. Now, initially, in 1830, we had told Native Americans that the land west of the Mississippi River was pretty much theirs. As we discover that the land west of the Mississippi River has something we want, we begin to take that back, that idea, and we begin to force the Native Americans on reservations and limit where they're allowed to live. How do we get them to move on to reservations, to move on to these limited lands? Well, one of the things we do is we promise food and supplies. And we tell Native American tribes who are struggling, if you move on to these Native American reservations, you live on this set land that we give you, the United States government will give you all the food, all the blankets, all the clothing, all the housing you need to survive. And some Native Americans were kind of forced to do this because whites moving west on the railroad had killed almost all of the buffalo. And so their traditional food, clothing, and housing source was gone, and out of desperation, they moved on to the reservations. Now, why do we do this? One, we want to free up land that we consider valuable, and the land that we're giving them, we actually consider useless. However, as we discovered things on those reservations we like, we consistently broke our treaties with the natives and tried to buy back the land that we had said there was the Native Americans. And if they wouldn't sell it back to us, sometimes we just forcibly moved the Native Americans off. If, for example, gold was found on the reservation, or if we did discover that it was excellent farmland. Now, as you can imagine, not all Native Americans complied with this. They weren't happy. And so some Native Americans fought back. And as they fought back, there was conflict after conflict in the West, and there were battles between the settlers, between the Native Americans, between the United States Army. And for a while, one of the things the government did was they tried increasing the military presence in the West. And they thought if there was more military out West, perhaps things would be calmer. And the military's main job was to protect the white settlers from the Native Americans. This worked well when the military was right around the settlers, but the settlers were spread out. The Native Americans who weren't living on the reservations were spread out. And so it really wasn't an effective policy by the government to accomplish what they wanted. So the next thought was that A, we need more farmland, and B, the Native Americans living their traditional white lifestyle is causing conflict. So to get the more land and to deal with the fact that Native Americans and whites were in conflict, the United States government came up with the Dawes Act. What they did was they divided the reservations up into individual farm plots. And they then took and said, oh, after we did all that, you clearly didn't need all that land. And they sold any land in a reservation that wasn't given to a Native American as a farm plot. They sold it as extra land to the whites. Now, Native Americans still living their traditional lives was causing conflict with the whites. And so the Dawes Act worked hard to encourage Native Americans to assimilate, to become more white, to give up their native culture. So our goal was to get more land from the natives and force them to assimilate. We see this in two ways. One, if we look down here at this picture, similar to the ones you looked at in class, we see a Native American boy here dressed in his very traditional garb, clothing. And then on the right, we see that same Native American boy in assimilated clothing. His hair has been cut, his clothing has been changed, and he would more easily blend into white culture, although whites didn't accept him. How did the government do this? Well, they encouraged natives to send their children to boarding schools where the children were told they had to learn to speak English, they had to practice white culture, and they were punished quite heavily if they didn't. Unfortunately, when the children left the boarding schools and they went back home to their families on the reservations, they found they didn't really fit in with that culture anymore. But if they tried to live in white society, they found they weren't really accepted there either. So it created generations of Native Americans who really felt like they had a foot in both worlds, but didn't really belong in either. So again, to encourage westward expansion, the United States government develops policies which work to reduce the Native American presence, the Native American influence on the West. And we can see that through these maps. Look at how much land was given or settled by Native Americans in 1850. We see right following the Civil War in 1865. By 1880, this is after the Dawes Act. And then we can see the sad result of all of these policies towards Native Americans all the way up into 1990. And so these government policies had very long-lasting effects on the Native Americans. Hopefully, this gave you a quick overview, quick review, and helps you understand the unit. Look back at your unit overview page. Make sure you understand the vocabulary. Make sure you can answer those top essential questions and the review questions at the bottom. We'll talk more about this tomorrow in class.